The Man of Stone by Hazel Heald with H.P. Lovecraft. Part 1. Ben Hayden was always a stubborn chap, and once he had heard about those strange statues in the upper Adirondacks, nothing could keep him from going to see them. I had been his closest acquaintance for years, and our Damon and Pythias friendship made us inseparable at all times. So when Ben firmly decided to go, well, I had to trot along too, like a faithful collie. "Jack," he said, you know Henry Jackson who was up in a shack beyond Lake Placid for that beastly spot in his lung? Well, he came back the other day nearly cured, but had a lot to say about some devilish queer conditions up there. He ran into the business all of a sudden and can't be sure yet that it's anything more than a case of bizarre sculpture. But just the same, his uneasy impression sticks. It seems he was out hunting one day and came across a cave with what looked like a dog in front of it. Just as he was expecting the dog to bark, he looked again and saw that the thing wasn't alive at all. It was a stone dog, such a perfect image, down to the smallest whisker, that he couldn't decide whether it was a supernaturally clever statue or a petrified animal. He was almost afraid to touch it. But when he did, he realized it was surely made of stone. After a while, he nerved himself up to go into the cave, and there he got a still bigger jolt. Only a little way in there was another stone figure, or what looked like it, but this time it was a man's. It lay on the floor, on its side, wore clothes, and had a peculiar smile on its face. This time Henry didn't stop to do any touching, but beat it straight for the village mountain top, Of course he asked questions, but they did not get him very far. He found he was on a ticklish subject, for the natives only shook their heads, crossed their fingers, and muttered something about a mad Dan, whoever he was. It was too much for Jackson, so he came home weeks ahead of his planned time. He told me all about it because he knows how fond I am of strange things, and oddly enough I was able to fish up a recollection that dovetailed pretty neatly with his yarn. Do you remember Arthur Wheeler, the sculptor who was such a realist that people began calling him nothing but a solid photographer? I think you knew him slightly. Well, as a matter of fact, he ended up in that part of the Adirondacks himself, spent a lot of time there, and then dropped out of sight. Never heard from again. Now, if stone statues that look like men and dogs are turning up around there, it looks to me as if they might be his work, no matter what the rustics say or refuse to say about them. Of course, a fellow with Jackson's nerves might easily get flighty and disturbed over things like that, but I'd have done a lot of examining before running away. In fact, Jack, I'm going up there now to look things over, and you're coming along with me. It would mean a lot to find Wheeler, or any of his work. Anyhow, the mountain air will brace us both up. So less than a week later, after a long train ride and a jolting bus trip through breathlessly exquisite scenery, we arrived at Mountain Top in the late, golden sunlight of a June evening. The village comprised only a few small houses, a hotel, and the general store at which our bus drew up, but we knew that the latter would probably prove a focus for such information. Surely enough, the usual group of idlers was gathered around the steps, and when we represented ourselves as health seekers in search of lodgings, they had many recommendations to offer. Though we had not planned to do any investigating till the next day, Ben could not resist venturing some vague, cautious questions when he noticed the senile garrulousness of one of the ill-clad loafers. He felt from Jackson's previous experience that it would be useless to begin with references to the queer statues. but decided to mention Wheeler as one whom we had known and in whose fate we consequently had a right to be interested. The crowd seemed uneasy when Sam stopped his whittling and started talking, but they had slight occasion for alarm. Even this barefoot old mountain decadent tightened up when he heard Wheeler's name, and only with difficulty could Ben get anything coherent out of him. "Wheeler?" he had finally wheezed. "Oh yeah, that feller as was all the time blasting rocks and cutting them up into statues. So you knowed him, hey? Well, they ain't much we can tell you, and maybe that's too much. He stayed out to Mad Dan's cabin in the hills, but not so very long. Got so he wanted no more. By Dan, that is. Kinda soft-spoken and got around Dan's wife till the old devil took notice. Pretty sweet on her, I guess. But he took the trail sudden, and nobody's seen hide nor hair of him since. Dan must have told him something pretty plain. Bad fella to get agin you, Dan is. Better keep away from thar boys, for they ain't no good in that part of the hills. Dan's been working up a worse and worse mood, and ain't seen about no more. Nor his wife neither. Guess he's penned her up so's nobody else can make eyes at her." As Sam resumed his whittling after a few more observations, Ben and I exchanged glances. Here, surely, was a new lead which deserved intensive following up. Deciding to lodge at the hotel, we settled ourselves as quickly as possible, planning for a plunge into the wild, hilly country on the next day. At sunrise we made our start, each bearing a knapsack laden with provisions and such tools as we thought we might need. The day before us had an almost stimulating air of invitation, through which only a faint undercurrent of the sinister ran. Our rough mountain road quickly became steep and winding, so that before long our feet ached considerably. After about 2 miles we left the road, crossing a stone wall on our right near a great elm, and striking off diagonally toward a steeper slope according to the chart and directions which Jackson had prepared for us. It was rough and briary travelling, but we knew that the cave could not be far off. In the end we came upon the aperture quite suddenly, a black, bush-grown crevice where the ground shot abruptly upward, and beside it, near a shallow rock pool, a small, still figure stood rigid, as if rivaling its own uncanny petrification. It was a grey dog, or a dog statue, and as our simultaneous gasp died away, we scarcely knew what to think. Jackson had exaggerated nothing, and we could not believe that any sculptor's hand had succeeded in producing such perfection. Every hair of the animal's magnificent coat seemed distinct, and those on the back were bristled up as if some unknown thing had taken him unaware. Ben, at last half kindly touching the delicate stony fur, gave vent to an exclamation. "Good God, Jack, but this can't be any statue. Look at it, all the little details and the way the hair lies. None of Wheeler's technique here. This is a real dog, though heaven only knows how he ever got in this state, just like stone. Feel for yourself. Do you suppose there's any strange gas that sometimes comes out of the cave and does this to animal life? We ought to have looked more into the local legends, and if this is a real dog, or was a real dog, then that man inside must be the real thing too." It was with a good deal of genuine solemnity, almost dread, that we finally crawled on hands and knees through the cave mouth, Ben leading. The narrowness looked hardly 3 feet, after which the grotto expanded in every direction to form a damp, twilight chamber floored with rubble and detritus. For a time we could make out very little, but as we rose to our feet and strained our eyes, we began slowly to descry a recumbent figure amidst the greater darkness ahead. Ben fumbled with his flashlight, but hesitated for a moment before turning it on the prostrate figure. We had little doubt that the stony thing was what had once been a man, and something in the thought unnerved us both. When Ben at last sent forth the electric beam, we saw that the object lay on its side, back toward us. It was clearly of the same material as the dog outside, but was dressed in the mouldering and unpetrified remains of rough sport clothing. Braced as we were for a shock, we approached quite calmly to examine the thing, Ben going around to the other side to glimpse the averted face. Neither could possibly have been prepared for what Ben saw when he flashed the light on those stony features. His cry was wholly excusable, and I could not help echoing it as I leapt to his side and shared the sight. Yet it was nothing hideous or intrinsically terrifying. It was merely a matter of recognition, for beyond the least shadow of a doubt this chilly rock figure with its half-frightened, half-bitter expression had at one time been our old acquaintance, Arthur Wheeler. Some instinct sent us staggering and crawling out of the cave and down the tangled slope to a point whence we could not see the ominous stone dog. We hardly knew what to think, for our brains were churning with conjectures and apprehensions. Ben, who had known Wheeler well, was especially upset, and seemed to be piecing together some threads I had overlooked. Again and again as we paused on the green slope, he repeated, "Poor Arthur, poor Arthur." But not till he muttered the name Mad Dan did I recall the trouble into which, according to old Sam Poole, Wheeler had run just before his disappearance. Mad Dan, Ben implied, would doubtless be glad to see what had happened. For a moment it flashed over both of us that the jealous host might have been responsible for the sculptor's presence in this evil cave, but the thought went as quickly as it came. The thing that puzzled us most was to account for the phenomenon itself. What gaseous emanation or mineral vapor could have wrought this change in so relatively short a time was utterly beyond us. Normal petrification, we know, is a slow chemical replacement process requiring vast ages for completion. Yet here were two stone images which had been living things, or at least Wheeler had, only a few weeks before. Conjecture was useless. Clearly, nothing remained but to notify the authorities and let them guess what they might. And yet at the back of Ben's head that notion about Mad Dan still persisted. Anyhow, we clawed our way back to the road, but Ben did not turn toward the village, but looked along upward toward where old Sam had said Dan's cabin lay. It was the second house from the village the ancient loafer had wheezed, and lay on the left far back from the road in a thick copse of scrub oaks. Before I knew it, Ben was dragging me up the sandy highway past a dingy farmstead and into a region of increasing wildness. It did not occur to me to protest, but I felt a certain sense of mounting menace as the familiar marks of agriculture and civilization grew fewer and fewer. At last, the beginning of a narrow, neglected path opened up on our left, while the peaked roof of a squalid, unpainted building shewed itself beyond a sickly growth of half-dead trees. This, I knew, must be Mad Dan's cabin, and I wondered that Wheeler had ever chosen so unprepossessing a place for his headquarters. I dreaded to walk up that weedy, uninviting path, but could not lag behind when Ben strode determinedly along and began a vigorous rapping at the rickety, musty-smelling door. There was no response to the knock, and something in its echoes sent a series of shivers through one. Ben, however, was quite unperturbed, and at once began to circle the house in quest of unlocked windows. The third that he tried, in the rear of the dismal cabin, proved capable of opening, and after a boost and a vigorous spring he was safely inside and helping me after him. The room in which we landed was full of limestone and granite blocks, chiseling tools and clay models, and we realized at once that it was Wheeler's erstwhile studio. So far we had not met with any sign of life, but over everything hovered a damnably ominous, dusty odor. On our left was an open door, evidently leading to a kitchen on the chimney side of the house, and through this Ben started, intent on finding anything he could concerning his friend's last habitat. He was considerably ahead of me when he crossed the threshold, so that I could not see at first what brought him up short and wrung a low cry of horror from his lips. In another moment, though, I did see, and repeated his cry as instinctively as I had done in the cave. For here in this cabin, far from any subterranean depths which could breed strange gases and work strange mutations, were two stony figures which I knew at once were no products of Arthur Wheeler's chisel. In a rude armchair before the fireplace, bound in position by the lash of a long, rawhide whip, was the form of a man, unkempt, elderly, and with a look of fathomless horror on its evil, petrified face. On the floor beside it lay a woman's figure, graceful and with a face betokening considerable youth and beauty. Its expression seemed to be one of sardonic satisfaction, and near its outflung right hand was a large tin pail, somewhat stained on the inside as with a darkish sediment. We made no move to approach those inexplicably petrified bodies, nor did we exchange any but the simplest conjectures. That this stony couple had been Mad Dan and his wife we could not well doubt, but how to account for their present condition was another matter. As we looked horrifiedly around, we saw the suddenness with which the final development must have come, for everything about us seemed, despite a heavy coating of dust, to have been left in the midst of commonplace household activities. The only exception to this rule of casualness was on the kitchen table, in whose cleared center, as if to attract attention, lay a thin, battered, blank book weighted down by a sizable tin funnel. Crossing to read the thing, Ben saw that it was a kind of diary or set of dated entries written in a somewhat cramped and none too practiced hand. The very first words riveted my attention, and before 10 seconds had elapsed, he was breathlessly devouring the halting text, I avidly following as I peered over his shoulder. As we read on, moving as we did so into the less loathsome atmosphere of the adjoining room, many obscure things became terribly clear to us, and we trembled with a mixture of complex emotions. This is what we read, and what the coroner read later on. The public has seen a highly twisted and sensationalized version in the cheap newspapers, but not even that has more than a fraction of the genuine terror which the simple original held for us as we puzzled it out alone in that musty cabin among the wild hills, with two monstrous stone abnormalities lurking in the death-like silence of the next room. When we had finished, Ben pocketed the book with a gesture half of repulsion, and his first words were, "Let's get out of here." Silently and nervously we stumbled to the front of the house, unlocked the door, and began the long tramp back to the village. There were many statements to make and questions to answer in the days that followed, and I do not think that either Ben or I can ever shake off the effects of the whole harrowing experience. Neither can some of the local authorities and city reporters who flocked around, even though they burned a certain book and many papers found in attic boxes and destroyed considerable apparatus in the deepest part of that sinister hillside cave. But here is the text itself.